Howdy my totally tubular gamers, and we are back for yet again another ranking video. And today's ranking video is going to be on one of the greatest series in cinema, in film, ever. Not only animated movies, but movies in general, Toy Story. If you don't know Toy Story in the year 2021, you're probably living under a rock, and I'm really not going to explain what it's about. It's a very successful series of movies, all animated, all by Pixar, all wonderful. I pretty much have seen all of them from when they came out, except maybe the first one, and I've always loved Toy Story. And naturally, with an IP as big as Toy Story, as successful as Toy Story, with as much money to make as Toy Story by Disney, of course, the money makers, well, naturally there's been some video games based on Toy Story. There has been a few games over the years based on the Toy Story property, and I've actually played through all of them, and I actually reviewed all of them a couple years ago. And so I thought it would be fun to rank the Toy Story games. There hasn't been a new one since I did that video, actually. So we will be ranking all of the Toy Story video games. Now, I will not be doing any phone-related games. I usually just don't touch phone games. That goes for Toy Story. And I will only be doing one version of each game. See, almost every single one of these games has multiple versions. I mean, some of them have upwards of like half a dozen versions. And so we're just going to be doing one version of each game on this list, and it'll be just the version that I played. I don't know all the differences for every version, so we're just going to be all inclusive here and say it's all the versions. How about that? Okay, hopefully you get what I'm talking about. Now let's just get started. What do I think is the worst Toy Story game of them all? I think the worst Toy Story game of them all is definitely the Buzz Lightyear of Star Command video game based on the show with the same name. Now, when it comes to the show, I never really watched it. I don't really have an opinion on it. It doesn't seem to be available anywhere these days, like Netflix or Disney Plus or anything, so big missed opportunity there. Anyway, the game, I guess, takes place during the show. I guess it's episodes. They play a lot of the episodes, it looks like, throughout the game. Really, it's about Buzz fighting Zurg. The gameplay is really weird. Like, it's a racing game, but it's also a bit of a platformer. Like, you run in a very straight line. It's very akin to, say, Crash Bandicoot. However, you are racing one of the villains, I guess, of the show. Along these racetracks, there's lots of platforming. There's, like, little vehicles you can get on. There's enemies to shoot. And they try to add some obstacles along the way. And then, assuming you win the race, you get to the enemy's lair, and I guess you fight him in a boss fight. This structure is very weird and just does not work for a variety of reasons. The controls are just absolutely atrocious. They're very tank-like, very sluggish. They're very unresponsive, actually. Buzz's movement is very stilted and slow. These tracks don't do anything interesting at all. Even when they add like a vehicle, it's still essentially a straight line you're going down. Nothing stands out. All the levels really blend into themselves. I couldn't tell you the difference between any of the levels. The game gets generally repetitive quite quickly. A lot of the racetracks use reused elements. The shooting isn't very good, and then the boss fights, the less said about them the better, because these are just bad. The camera is particularly terrible. The game has this metal system, and it honestly just leads to padding. Even with this padding, the game is like 3 hours long, and I just did not have a good time playing this game. I think this is a very mediocre game. It also looks terrible, it sounds terrible, and it generally plays terrible, and I can't recommend this game to anybody. The next game on our list is Toy Story Mania. Now, this game is interesting. It's actually based on the Disneyland, specifically California Adventure ride, which I've gone on a couple times. It's a really fun time, and I've never not been smiling the whole time. This game, though, really isn't that good. It's basically if they took the ride and extended it out over a few hours. Now, the ride is a rail shooter, basically, in 3D, and it's, again, always a great time. This game is really basic, and all of the minigames are essentially the same thing, where instead of pulling back on the gun like you would for the ride, you're just pointing with the Wii remote, and there's, again, not very much to it. The game is very basic. It doesn't do anything different. It doesn't do anything really interesting. It's as different as the ride would be. However, the ride is... it's a ride. It's like, it's only a few minutes. This is stretched out to a few hours, and it does have some multiplayer that could be fun, but this game ultimately just doesn't really do all that much. It's not terrible. I mean, it's a competent enough, like, point-and-click shooter, but it doesn't do anything past that. They got the aesthetic right. I mean, it looks just like the ride, so that's obviously good, and the voice acting is on point, the sound in general is on point, but the general gameplay, really, there's just not much to talk about here. I mean, you just point and shoot. All the mini games are pretty much the same. There's some other ones in here where they might be a little different, but there really is nothing to write home about. I remember when this came out, it had some hype behind it because the ride was so popular, but it had just come out, and I'll be honest, all these years later, there's really nothing to write home about with this one. I would just say ride the ride, forget the game, because ultimately that's what it is. The game's very forgettable. The next game on our list is actually the latest Toy Story game, and it's based off of Toy Story 3. Yeah, it's the Toy Story 3 movie game released for a ton of platforms. Toy Story 3 has two big game modes to it, the story mode and the toy box mode. We'll start with the story mode, which is where it plays through Toy Story 3 the movie. However, if you haven't seen the movie, no reason for you to really play this game, as it doesn't actually go through the movie. It just kind of hits on the biggest beats. It doesn't really give any context to anything. You have to have seen the movie to get that context, but it is a movie-based game. It is primarily a 3D platformer where you just kind of go through A to B. There's occasionally some other objectives in there, but it mostly is a pretty average 3D platformer that takes maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours at most to go through. I mean, I'll be honest, I think the movie's longer. No, the big selling point of the game was the toy box mode, which is this alternate game mode that really does try to do something different. This is actually an open world game where you get missions from other Toy Story characters. You can play as any of the main three characters, and you just kind of go around talking to other Toy Story or even Disney characters and just get missions for them and just try to have a little bit of fun. By completing these missions, you get new costumes, new levels, new buildings to put up in your town. There's a couple new things you get, and it's mostly a customizable sandbox. However, I'm not going to say that the missions of the open world are compelling in any sense of the word, because they're absolutely not. They're very basic missions, and they're very clearly aimed towards children. I'm definitely in the wrong demographic here, so I'm going to give the game some slack, as it clearly is geared towards children, just the entire game, as it is very basic, and it's almost baby's first open world game. Like, that's how small the map is and how easy it is to find the missions and just do the missions in general. I would say as a whole, Toy Story 3 is a very average video game. It doesn't do anything amazing, but it's not offensive. It doesn't do anything bad either. It's just a very middling game overall. At its worst, it's boring. At its best, it's alright. There's just not all that much to it. And in the number 3 spot, we have the original Toy Story game, the OG, on the Super Nintendo and Genesis. The game follows the original Toy Story very well, I might add, for the times, as it does have almost every scene from the movie in it. It actually does do a decent job of conveying the movie, and while it does have a few little extra parts here and there, again, it does follow the movie very well. The game is primarily a 2D platformer, and something interesting is it does have Donkey Kong Country style graphics, as it has those like 3D models that have been turned into sprites, and you know, I think it actually looks pretty alright even nowadays. Now, out of all the games on this list, this is the game I have the most nostalgia with. This was one of the first games I ever played in my life, and don't get me wrong, I love this game to pieces, but I know in many aspects that it's not that great of a game. The game has plenty of things going for it. Obviously, the graphics. It has a very good soundtrack, surprisingly. It tells the story of the movie very well, and the game even has a number of levels that mix it up that are not your standard 2D platformer, like when you're on RC. These are fun times. However, I can't talk about this game without talking about its difficulty, how cheap it is, and its poor hit detection. By God, this game as a kid pissed me the hell off. I thought that this game was absolutely impossible as a child. I thought this game is impossible, it's not meant for me to beat it, and you know what? Coming back all these years later, this is not an easy game. A lot of the platforming is very precise. In fact, the whole game's precise. You need to be framed, no, pixel perfect for a lot of the platforming. When you throw your string, like, you need to be absolutely pixel perfect or you will miss and you will die. The game is very stingy with its lives and general continues, and this is just a very 90s balls hard platformer. And the hit detection is very poor as well, as you'll get hit by stuff that clearly you weren't even touching. I mean, don't even get me started on the boss fights because of this. Every boss fight should be really easy, but because of this poor hit detection, it ends up not being easy. I played this game through again on the Super Nintendo Classic with the rewind feature, only to see that half the time I wasn't even freaking touching whatever killed me. I just got hit because Woody is just way too big of a hitbox. And again, the game has a number of enjoyable moments, and it does have a number of great levels. I still had a pretty good time with it, but I can tell you that it's just not as amazing as it could have been. I think this could have been a very solid 2D platformer, and it could be a very underrated game. However, due to the game's, again, just extremely high difficulty for the wrong reasons, It just keeps it down and keeps it to just an average to, at the very best, just an alright good game. And it is not for the faint of heart, not at all. This is a hard as balls game. And in the number 2 spot we have Toy Story Racer for the PlayStation. I would say that Toy Story Racer is not only a hidden gem, but it's one of the most underrated games on the PlayStation and is up there for the most underrated racing game on the PS1. Now, I know that you might think this is a kart racer or a Mario Kart ripoff, but this is much more like Micro Machines rather than Mario Kart. There's no drifting, there's no jumping, the cars accelerate very quickly, they don't have a high top speed, and you can turn very easily. They bounce around on everything, and all of the courses are extremely unique as you're still toys, so simple areas such as Andy's house become a very interesting racetrack. The game features 200 missions, yes, 200 missions, and each mission could be something like racing or a kind of Mario Kart battle style mode or survival mode, and a couple other mini games in there, so there's plenty of content to go around here. There's tons to unlock here, such as new racetracks and new characters and even more. Surprisingly, this game only includes Toy Story 1 in it when it comes to characters and like the areas, even though this game came out years after Toy Story 2. But that doesn't really play a factor into this game, as I think it's a very enjoyable time. Overall, this game, it looks pretty alright for the PS1, it has some pretty good music, and it plays pretty nice as well, and again, very underrated. I have like almost never seen anybody talk about this game because most people probably think it's shovelware, but it's actually not. Sure, the game does get pretty repetitive towards the end with its many missions, and the survival battle arena style thing is just not very good. But again, I had a really nice time with it, and I think that this game deserves even a little more attention than it got, which was basically nothing. And I got no problem recommending it to anyone who likes Toy Story or looking for a different kind of racer. And the best Toy Story game of them all has to be Toy Story 2, the game. Just like how I feel about the Toy Story movies, I think Toy Story 2 is just the best of them all and it gets the most right. Toy Story 2 has become a very nostalgia-heavy, cherished game over the years, and it's almost become a bit of a legend of how it's just a great movie-tying game and a very solid 3D platformer overall, and you know, I agree, this is absolutely a hidden gem on every console it was released on. The game does play it pretty straight, and it is, for the most part, by the numbers and a pretty standard 3D platformer for the time, but it really understands the Toy Story brand and just the world of Toy Story. It really is a collectathon, as you just kind of collect a bunch of stuff in these levels, and the main collectible is these Pizza Planet tokens. And this game does feature a more Banjo-Kazooie style approach where you're just dropped into, again, these relatively big levels, and you just gotta figure out how to get all the collectibles in it. The biggest strength I can say that the game has is these levels, is again, it really understands what Toy Story is about, and it takes a bunch of basically mundane environments and makes them really interesting levels because you are a toy. And sure, this game doesn't do anything wild or innovative or crazy, but what it does very well, as it is just a very solid 3D platformer with good controls, minus the Dreamcast version, nice graphics, a great soundtrack, and it's just overall a really fun time. A lot of the platforming is actually decently challenging, and I can't imagine a child doing some of this because even I was like, this is not the easiest thing in the world, and it's not too challenging or ridiculous like the original Toy Story game. No, this game gets it just right. There's a lot of nods to the movie, there's actually a decent amount of fan service if you really love Toy Story, and there's a lot of attention to detail, such as when you go first person to shoot Buzz's laser and you see the reflection of his face. Like, that's a great detail. I didn't think any of the collectibles were overly annoying, there's not too many of them, and the game ends before it gets repetitive, and I thought that the length was pretty nice. 100% in the game was a really fun time, and I just had a really enjoyable time with Toy Story 2, and I can see why so many people have it in such a high regard, because it is a very solid 3D platformer. It really reminds me of SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom, where it's like, yeah, on its own, it's just okay, but with the brand, with the license, it's just becomes something else. It becomes really good. And Toy Story 2, out of all the games on this list, absolutely recommend Toy Story 2 the most. I think it's the one that really deserves to be played nowadays. And if you had to only play one, obviously it's going to be Toy Story 2, as this is the best one. It is available on the PlayStation Network store for however long that's going to be. Who knows at this point. Or you can just buy it on the original hardware, which it's on plenty of consoles. But anyway, that's my list. That's the Toy Story games ranked. I thought it would be fun to rank all of them since I played all of them. Tell me what your favorite is. It's probably Toy Story 2 in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If you made it to this part of the video, thank you so much. How about you We could have like a code word or something if you can think of something in the comments. I don't know. Either way, like, sub, share, all that stuff. Anyway, see ya.